I'm Andy McAfee. I'm the co-director and co-founder of the IDE. We are really happy to have Zoe Cullen with us today for the seminar. Before we turn it over to Zoe, just a couple very quick housekeeping notes. First of all, we want you to know that you are a respected and valued member of the IDE community. However, we don't want to see you or hear you during the seminar. So if you could please mute your connection and turn off video, that will save us crosstalk and bandwidth and all kinds of things. We do want to know your thoughts and questions, however. So please use the chat function that we're by now intimately familiar with on Zoom, and we'll use that to pose questions for Zoe. Unless there are absolutely burning questions or clarifications in the middle of her talk, we are going to save the questions for the end, for when she's done with her prepared remarks, and then let her engage with the questions that we have put up there. Thanks very much. I want to introduce Zoe Cullen, who is in the entrepreneurial management at Harvard Business School. She's been there since 2018. Prior to that, she worked for a couple years as the chief economist for a bank in Asia. And prior to that, she was a PhD student at Stanford in economics. She's going to talk to us today about a topic that I find absolutely fascinating, which is measuring labor demand for workers with a criminal conviction. How are we doing at bringing those kinds of people into the workforce? Zoe, over to you and your screen.
Thank you very much. So with that, I hope you can all see the slides. I appreciate the introduction and the invitation. It's obviously a pleasure to be speaking to this group. I wish we had this group at HBS. So today I'm going to describe to you some ongoing work with Will Doby and Mitch Hoffman. This is a paper about measuring labor demand for workers with a criminal conviction. It's also a paper about how to increase demand for this workforce. And I think in a moment it'll be clear how this is tied to the digital transformation. So with many advances in AI, we also, especially around identity verification and the classification of court records, we also had the arrival of very highly accessible 24-hour comprehensive background checks that are priced reasonably. So many large labor platforms are now using this for every applicant and doing it multiple times while they're on the platform. So, we don't have a precise relationship between the accessibility of these services and the demand for the services, but over the same time frame, we've seen just a dramatic shift in the use. So the number of employers who report using a criminal background check to screen out workers at the time of hire has risen from, in the 90s, what looked like a third of employers, and it's now creeping up towards 80% of employers. At the same time, we have these intermediaries, much like the labor platform that I'm going to describe to you today, that are not beholden to the same laws that employers are. So many states have limits on the look-back period, but because the platforms are not actually making the hiring decision themselves, they are not subject to the same laws. But at the same time, they're obviously in a position to make the decision on behalf of tens of thousands of employers by pre-screening access to the marketplace. Okay, so this is the background about the context we're studying, and more generally, we see that there's persistently high unemployment in this group of people who have a rap sheet. I'm saying a past criminal conviction to include this group, but it's actually a larger group than that gets screened out typically. So a standard package that a labor platform will use screens out about a third of individuals. And in the United States, generally, there are as many people with a rap sheet that would disqualify them as there are people with a college education. So it's clear, it was easy for us to find a partner because the cost and also the incredible impact it has on the applicant pool, there's the motivation to shift away from this. But there's really an important question we don't know the answer to, which is why are firms interested in using this screening device? So what exactly is it about a criminal record that disqualifies someone from a job? And what would be the alternatives that are suitable while maintaining demand? So let me just describe exactly what we're going to do in the paper. So I mentioned that we're collaborating a large staffing platform. And the objective of the partnership is to see their transition away from background checks. And so there's, of course, some sensitivity around this, so I can't explain exactly what the company is, but I can give you a lot of details. I'll give you a lot of details as to why we chose them to be the partner, why we think they're ideal for this project. So the first critical thing to know about them is that they serve traditional employers, so thousands of very large companies. They tend to be employers that are interested in filling entry-level positions, often for temporary things. So it can be as much as 100 workers for a single day. The commitment is typically very low, but the rate of repeat hiring is high. So half of the workers who are hired once are probably going to be hired a second time by the same employer. And so we think of the jobs as the type of jobs that place workers with a criminal conviction and where they can get a foothold to start matching with a variety of employers. So the other reason that this platform is really, the features of the platform is critical for the project is that they collect measures of performance. And I imagine many in this audience are familiar with these type of data. So at the end of a job, a match, the employer is going to evaluate the worker. There's an overall 1 to 5 point scale, and there's also a more detailed breakdown. And this is going to allow us to design alternatives that rely on performance screening, so to speak. And then the other thing is the platform asks employers to specify upfront the type of worker that can be assigned to their jobs. So because of this, we can look under specific conditions what types of employers would be willing to accept workers with a criminal conviction. And the employer understands that if the conditions that they describe are met, then the worker can be assigned to the job, will show up to the job. So it's effectively a hiring choice by saying we will accept workers who can do this, 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 and have a criminal record. So we're going to randomize the conditions that the employer faces, for example, like a particular wage subsidy, and then determine if under that condition they're willing to hire. And then we're going to, of course, be varying the types of policies that they face, so not just a wage subsidy, but also potentially insurance policies, and I'll walk through them. All right, so please feel free to interrupt me if I'm going to talk for the first 45 minutes, I understand, and then leave time for questions. But since a lot of this is front-loaded, I'm happy to pause at any time. All right, so this is the framework that we have in mind to fix ideas about which conditions we choose to show an employer. So you can imagine an employer assesses their expected profits from a particular worker by comparing what they think the expected productivity is going to be and the wage. And this would just be a very simplistic model of the decision. In the case of a worker with a criminal conviction, there might be this additional consideration of what's the likelihood of a bad incident and how costly is that incident going to be. So given this framework, here are some of the policies that we predict are going to be very effective at shifting demand. So wage subsidies. So these have been studied in the past, and there's some evidence that they actually stigmatize workers. So we're going to be paying very close attention to the zero wage subsidy versus a higher number. But we're going to go up to all the way up to providing a free worker and to see what demand looks like under that condition. We also think that an insurance policy for crime and safety, the damages that occur on the job, we'd expect this to be effective at increasing demand, especially in the types of jobs that have potentially high value inventory or face-to-face customer interactions. So we're going to test that interaction specifically. And then we also think that performance screening has the possible, can possibly speak to the expected productivity of these workers. And there's evidence that the performance screening has helped other disadvantaged groups in the past. Okay, so there's obviously other things going on. We're going to be focused on these three, especially in the presentation. I'll be focused on these three policies. But of course, there's in the background, there's labor market conditions. Higher unemployment might lead to lower demand, the type of crime that the person's committed and the job type. These are all things that we explore and test demand variation for, but they'll be a smaller part of the presentation. All right, so let me summarize the findings. First of all, if you just asked this group of clients, so these relatively large employers, are you willing to hire a worker with a criminal conviction without the wage subsidy, without any of the policies I just described, what share of them say yes? And that share actually turns out to be 40%. So this was higher than our partner, our labor platform partner expected. This number drops when the job type is customer facing. It drops significantly when there's high value inventory. So there's different types of jobs that already seem to be more or less amenable, even among low skilled work. We then use this wage subsidy randomization, estimate what the elasticity of demand is. So essentially, if we were to start dramatically increasing wage subsidies, by how much can we increase demand? And it turns out we can get up to about 56% saying yes. So it's a very relatively small, low, or small in magnitude elasticity. So 0.24 is our estimated elasticity. And for those who have seen the ranges here, that's on the lower end for all different types of workers. And we're also going to find that among the policies that I described, so including these insurance options, the performance screening, and also productivity information, these all tend to be effective at increasing demand, and they're much more cost effective than the wage subsidy. So looking into the future, we have a strong sense of the platform, with the direction the platform is going to move in, and it's very likely going to be a very a modest form of insurance and a performance screening. All right, so just to place this in the literature, of course, like we're benefiting from an impressive literature that came before us. So I'm listing here several audit studies that showed differential callback rates for workers with a criminal conviction, those without. So this was the first test of demand in some sense. And probably the closest paper to ours is Hunt et al. From 2018, which is using extensive surveys of employers to ask about their interests directly in hiring under different policies. So when we designed these policies, we also were building off as a literature on hiring and demand for disadvantaged workers. For example, this paper by Mandy Pallas is showing that new workers in the labor market benefit tremendously from having that first performance rating. And so indeed, this is how we end up designing our performance screening, knowing that it's very easy for the platform to execute and has had a lot of traction. There's a paper here that I want to highlight by Bertless, just to warning us of the stigma of wage subsidies. So I want that to always be in the back of our mind, even though we don't find strong evidence of that. Okay, and then on the methods, so you'll see here that we're especially focused on ruling out experimenter demand effects, pro-social reasons why employers might say they would hire this group, but maybe wouldn't really hire this group. That's a real emphasis of this paper. And so we're using incentive compatible methods without, and we are building on Kessler, Lowe, Sullivan, and then this Alexander Moss Pallas paper here. We depart from it, but you'll see that the discrete choice experiment is very much designed to have real stakes and to elicit final decision making from the employers. Okay, so here's how the talk is going to go. I'll give you some more institutional details about this mysterious collaboration that we have, and then I'll talk about the design of the experiment, which again succeeds or fails based on whether you believe employers are really reporting truthful responses. And then I'm going to split the results into two parts. So one in terms of estimating elasticity of demand for this group, and then another focused on the different interventions that we think can be effective, especially at scale across labor platforms. And then I'll conclude. Okay, so this nameless staffing agency serves approximately 10,000 large employers nationwide. And in the paper, we can compare these particular employers to the universe of employers, because we've merged on name and industry and firm size. But one thing to note is that on average, they're much larger. So the average firm size is 433. In the universe, it's closer to 15. So there's a huge tail, obviously, of smaller businesses. And then in terms of industry coverage, you'll see it's not entirely representative, but there's wide coverage. And I can come back to that if there's more questions about the sample, then I'm perfectly happy to spend time on that at the end of the talk. So employers will post a job, and they post the qualifications. So this is really critical for the experiment design. This is a setting where the first mover is the employer, and then the platform gets to just assign the worker. Oftentimes it will be the same day. So this is an image of the setting. So the setting that the employer looks at when they go to enter their details. And so I can just draw your attention to these detailed requirements. So in this case, they have to be able to lift 50 pounds. They have to have non-slip shoes. They have to stand for 6 hours. They have to have a driver's license. And this can go on, including things like they need to have prior training in stadium management. And this is an important piece because for the employer, they don't get to make another decision after this. So when the assignment is made, the last resort for them is to cancel. So they can always cancel the job and send the worker home. In practice, that happens less than 1% of the time, but there's a good reason for that, which is the employer also has to pay half the wage bill anyways. So the cancellation rates are very low. And then there's a lot of emphasis in the platform on reposting the job. So you see a lot of employers basically repeatedly dipping into the same market for the same exact set of tasks. So that the way we communicate with the employers to gauge how they're going to modify their qualifications in the new world without a background check, potentially, is through communication that comes directly from the platform. So the researchers here, we remove ourselves. All the messaging to the employer clients is direct from the management of the platform. And they sent out what we are describing as a survey experiment to their wide base for them. So they sent it out to over 8,000 of their clients. Over 1,000 of them completed the survey. And all of this took place this year in the springtime. So between March and April, of course, conditions were changing quite rapidly then. So we actually have a good test of how local unemployment rates affect responses. But when they received this message asking for them to describe their qualifications, they didn't know that the survey was about criminal records. All they knew is that they would get $35 or $50 for this 10-minute survey. So not surprisingly, the ones who clicked through don't look dissimilar from the broader pool of those invited. And just to give you a sense, on average, they had 9 months experience hiring on the platform and 7.3 years hiring experience overall. And then an important question is sort of, do you have discretion to make this decision in the first place around expanding your pool of workers to include workers with a record? And we got a 73% saying that they can personally affect the firm's decision to hire this group. And of course, there's the remaining share they face a blanket firm level policy. So I would say this is a fair amount of discretion, not perfect coverage of that. And on average, those that had a blanket policy are actually more likely to say, yes, they can, in fact, hire. Okay, so now I get to describe the design of this experiment. Here's just a visual depiction of the modules in this survey experiment. The first module is all about eliciting demand for workers with a criminal conviction under different conditions. So that's the longest part of the survey experiment. But then it quickly moves into questions about beliefs. So what do you think is the performance that you would, that a worker with a criminal background would achieve compared to, say, the rest of the pool of workers? And then there's, in fact, a treatment. So some are randomized to learning more information about workers with a criminal record, and then everybody is allowed to adjust their answer to the first question: will you hire this group under these under a wage subsidy? So importantly, we're able to deliver information about how productive this group of workers with a criminal conviction are, because it just so happens that within that 24-hour turnaround period for the background check, a high enough share of workers complete the first job. And so there are first job completions for those who do have a criminal background. And we can compare that to the broader pool of people, and use that as our the information that we send to clients to see how important productivity beliefs are in this decision-making process. Okay, so at the very start of the survey, the client will see this introduction. It says, we, the platform, are considering expanding our pool of workers to include individuals that have a criminal record. If you indicate that you're interested in workers with a criminal record, then and only then your choice could affect whether those workers are able to accept the jobs you post. And these individuals will be at most 5% of your possible matches. And it's important to sort of give them a sense of the percentage here, because once they accept this group, they're not going to know who is who. Under this premise, everyone shows up looking alike. Next question is for everyone is, if the platform gave you an X% discount for workers with a criminal record, would you permit workers to perform the jobs you post? This would mean that you only pay 1 minus X of the wage for those with a criminal record, but the workers themselves are still going to receive full pay after the discount. So the platform is going to pay the difference. And this is in fact the truth about what the platform plans to do, and potentially offsets any kind of stigma that you might see going on here. So the wage subsidy is randomized. It ranges all the way from 0 to 100%. And the employer has 3 options for responding to this question. They can say, yes, I will accept this group, or they can say, only if it's hard to fill my job, or no. And for the purpose of this presentation, only if it's hard to fill my jobs is going to be lumped together with no. So when I said at the very beginning that the demand for workers under 0% subsidy, so no extra policy or anything like this, is 40%, that's 40% who say just yes. And it's a much higher share actually only if it's hard to fill my jobs. All right, so now let me show you, I'm gonna more or less show you graphs that summarize the raw data. So these are very non-parametric graphs. So basically each point here is going to be the share that say yes to the question I just described to you about hiring under a wage subsidy. The share that say yes under each of those subsidies that we randomized. So along the x-axis here, the effective wage, if you are at 100% effective wage, that's the 0% subsidy condition. And here's where we see that the 39% say, yes, I'll hire I'll hire workers of this background. And then you can see that as we increase the discount or decrease the effective wage, we can raise the demand, but only so much. So here with 100% wage subsidy, 56% of these firms are saying, okay, I'll accept workers with this background. So this is perhaps a modest rise in overall demand between 0 and 100% wage subsidy. And I'm going to show you this graph as the baseline. It's our benchmark for how cost effective these other policies are going to be. So let me just show you some heterogeneity here, because it seems to make quite a big difference what type of job exactly we're talking about. So in this context, 60% of the jobs involve customer interaction. And we can split this the same demand curve by those jobs that do and don't have an element of customer interaction. And the difference here is actually a full 12 percentage points. So those jobs that have no customer interaction, the demand is higher by 12 percentage points, which is a fairly large gap. And the same is true for those types of jobs that have high value inventory. Right? So here the gap is even larger for the jobs with high value inventory versus not. The gap between the demand on average is 17 percentage points. And that I think that actually is quite informative about how the employers are using the signal of having failed this screening test. So obviously one of the concerns that employers have is theft on the job. All right, so let me just describe, I'll summarize some of the other results that I can go into detail if there are questions about. But one important result from our perspective is that this demand is very inelastic to labor market tightness. So it's not, when we randomize conditions of local unemployment, so offering the employer the option of saying, yes, but only if unemployment is high, 10%. Offering an option doesn't change the answers that we get to these questions. And we also see that as the COVID pandemic is evolving and employment is spiking in different areas, we also don't see that the responses from different cities end up being correlated with local unemployment conditions. So our expectation is that a lot of these responses are going to, will have persisted throughout this pandemic and probably will persist afterwards. All right, so now I'm going to talk about what I'm describing to you as these interventions. So one of the, given what we've seen about how high value inventory jobs generate lower demand for workers with a criminal record, you might imagine that crime and safety insurance are going to be effective at essentially replacing the criminal background check. So what we offer is if the platform can cover damages up to X, where we randomize the cap of that insurance policy. So if we can randomize the cover for damages related to theft or safety incurred by workers with a criminal record, would you then permit these workers to perform jobs you post? And what I'm showing in the graph is the comparison between the baseline where they didn't have this insurance policy, but they still had the wage subsidy, with the $5,000 insurance cap. So in this case, you can see we get a boost in the demand. It's about 11 or 12 percentage points. And interestingly, when we raise the cap from 5,000 to 5 million, the boost that we see doesn't change very much. So, so there's about, on average, is about a 5 percentage point difference between the $5,000 cap and the $5 million cap. It's not true for all types. Some types of jobs are sensitive to the cap, which I'll show you in a minute, but this is, the way that we interpret this is evidence of the type of risk that we think employers fear the most, which might actually be modest in nature on the job rather than something astronomical. So this is just to be forthcoming that, of course, for some types of jobs, namely the ones that claim to have high value inventory, indeed, the boost that you get from going from 5,000 to 5 million is 20 percentage points, is quite high, whereas the boost is relatively small for half that size for those that don't have high value inventory. Okay, so that was one popular option that the platform discussed. Another popular option discussed with us, I think this is highly guided, but another option was a performance screening that was easy to execute for the platform. So this is enforcing some number of prior completed jobs before the employer says that this pool of workers can be included. So the exact wordings, if the platform required workers with a criminal record to have satisfactorily completed X jobs, receiving greater than 85% positive reviews. So that would be 5 stars. Would you permit such workers to perform the jobs you post? So, and here we randomize the job counts from 1 to 25 jobs. And the graph is showing you how the baseline rate of hiring compares to just having that first job review. And so here we get a 13 percentage point boost in demand from just 1 extra job. Adding 5 more jobs or 25 more jobs does nothing to change demand. So it's really that initial screening that's so relevant or so pertinent to the decision here. All right, so let me now just give an overview of the other sort of highlights from policies we evaluated. So I've described to you the 2 main ones, and now I'm going to just describe to you what else we learned from the survey. So you might imagine that not just the job type, but also the crime type is really relevant to this decision to hire. And especially now with the processing of criminal records and the ease with which you can classify things, it's actually not outlandish to think that each employer can sort of select exactly which types of crimes they would be interested in and under what conditions. Okay, so the platform is actually creating the structure to deal with some complexity like this. Now, one of the reasons that might be effective is because we see a dramatic change in demand based on exactly the type of crime. So for example, like the drug-related felonies, so even though they're serious felonies, face demand that's 24 percentage points higher than those who had a violent felony. So that's a larger difference than anything I've shown you so far. The difference between having committed a property or financial felony is smaller, so there's only 7 percentage point difference between property and financial versus violent. Perhaps that's to be expected in the context of a work environment. And then with misdemeanors, so if we move away from felonies towards misdemeanors, demand rises by 50%. So that's another huge gap in demand preferences driven by the severity of the crime. And then one thing that we learned, which is quite satisfying, is that the look-back period. I mentioned that these labor platforms don't have to adhere to a look-back period, but typically a state might enforce 7-year look-back period. But what we find is when we exclude anyone who has had their conviction in the most recent year, demand will jump by 17 percentage points. So that initial first year has a huge effect on demand. It keeps rising up until 3 years and then plateaus. So a look back period beyond 3 years appears to be not so important to employers. All right, so now we're moving to the another part of the survey experiment, the part where we actually elicit directly beliefs from the employer about what the performance of workers with a criminal record might be. And then we introduce an information provision experiment. So half of the subject pool are going to see something new. They're going to learn something. And then we allow everyone to adjust their answers. So we say at the end, all participants have the opportunity to change their earlier answers to the question about performance and also the question about saying yes to hiring. Okay, so in this question that we asked about performance was guided. So it said to the employer, in 2019, 86% of jobs on the platform resulted in a 5-star rating. So it gives them an overview of how everyone else is doing. And then asks, what percentage of jobs completed by people with a criminal record do you think result in the 5-star rating on the platform or a similar platform? And it's incentivized in the following way. We say, if you're within 5% of the truth, you're going to add another $10 to your reward for this survey. So, you know, potentially our hope is that they're really targeting or being forthcoming about their true beliefs here. Now, I've illustrated the distribution of those prior beliefs. Okay? So before learning anything, the average objective high performance share is this dashed line. So the truth is 87% of workers with a criminal record will have a 5-star rating. You can see that the distribution is skewed to the left of that. So 71% are guessing below the truth, but it is still the modal answer. So half of the participants, as I mentioned, are going to get this message that says 80% of jobs completed by workers with a criminal record did in fact result in a 5-star rating, so slightly better than the average population. And this in fact does shift beliefs. So when we ask again, what do you think is the performance rate, the performance record of workers with a criminal conviction, those who got the message shift their beliefs closer to the truth. And what we find is that with a 10% shift in beliefs about the about the actual productivity of the worker, or in this case, the likelihood of completing a job satisfactorily, that 10% shift corresponds to an 8% shift in hiring demand, right? Because we ask again, now that now you have a chance to reassess your answer to the question, and it's binding. Do you want to hire this population? After receiving information, we do see this bump up in hiring demand. And we can't reject symmetric effects. So for some people, their learning performance was lower than expected, and for some, their learning is higher than expected. It shifts demand in both directions. But on average, of course, because 71% of people underestimated the performance of these workers, on average, beliefs are shifting in the positive direction. That means that just providing some objective information about the group level performance was effective at raising demand by 7 percentage points on average. So this just happens to be on par with the $5,000 insurance cap and the one prior performance rating screening that we offered. So all three of these are increasing demand by a similar amount. And so an exercise we can now do is look at how these policies compare from a cost perspective or cost effectiveness perspective. So so suppose the thought experiment is this: how much would it cost using each of these policies to increase hiring by 10%? So if we were just going to use this wage subsidy, we would have to basically give all these, the whole pool of workers at a half off discount. I know that sounds awkward, but it would have to be a 50% wage subsidy to get this 10% boost. And if we take an hourly wage of $15 per hour, then this is $60 per worker per day. And if instead we think of insurance policy, which also increased demand by about 10% with the $5,000 insurance cap, in this case, under certain assumptions about the likelihood of a bad event, the range is already less than the wage subsidy. So if there's a bad event, 1 in every 1,000 for a given day, then this is $5 per worker per day. And if the risk is quite high, so 1 in 100 each day, then the cost is approximately $50 per worker per day. And now I want to talk about the other two because I have them listed here as free. And of course, they're not totally free, but the platform has found ways, very scalable ways to essentially make them free after engineering and overhead, administrative type fees. But essentially, you can imagine, given that 40% of employers were interested in hiring this group, even without any wage subsidy, you can imagine that first, the pool of workers with a criminal record are directed towards this group. If they meet the rating criteria, which given our past history on this is highly suggested that the vast majority will. If they do meet it, then they can be matched with the broader set of employers. And in that way, neither the platform nor us, the researchers, have to actually pay for this performance screening. It can be executed in this dynamic way. And so that's a policy that seems quite scalable on a labor platform. And then the other, as I mentioned, is providing just the objective facts at the group level of the productivity facts. So this would be essentially the same message, showing that workers with a criminal record get the 87% 5-star rating, which is typically better than the average person on the platform. So this is essentially what our collaborating partner took away from our study, and now is in the midst of implementing these. They of course are going to help do it in a way that tests to see if the responses to our survey experiment are in fact reflected when executed, and whether they continue to be true. So whether the demand response changes as employers get familiar with hiring from this pool and using these different policies. Okay, so to conclude, we found that without any incentives at all, over a third, maybe closer to 40%, are willing to hire workers with a criminal record for quite short-term work, of course. And the subsidies were effective at boosting the hiring rates, but we found that other policies were much more cost-effective. So we're highlighting performance history and the objective performance information because they can effectively be delivered for free. And then finally, there's this question of what can we glean from how employers generally are using the criminal screening for. So we had these, early on I described to you a framework where criminal records could in fact reflect both on the expected productivity of a worker. It could also reflect on the left tail risk of a worker. And we found evidence actually that both are probably at play. So it's obviously, it proves to be a signal that these workers are less productive. And we also see that it proves to be a signal of a modest left tail risk. So maybe not, so because the $5 million cap was not so much more effective than just the simple $5,000 cap, perhaps employers are not nervous about some of the worst crimes, but they are worried about what appears to be like theft or customer interactions that don't go well. So for this reason, so I hope, yes, so thank you. This is the conclusion, and I'm happy to talk about many other aspects of the survey in the discussion, and especially since this is, you can see that this is a two-part project. This, of course, is the elicitation of labor demand, and then now there's the execution across the whole platform. So suggestions about any aspect of this are still extremely relevant for the project. All right, thank you very much. I will turn it over or stop sharing. Actually, I might continue to share just in case the questions are related to the slide.
That'd be great, thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Zoe. This is really interesting work. So I'll open the floor for questions now, and while people maybe send them in, I have a couple of questions that I had that I can ask. I guess one question I had is, I know you don't have like the hugest sample because this is a survey experiment, but do you have any sense of, you talked about, the potential for these different interventions to cause like a 10% shift in labor demand. Is it possible that different interventions appeal to different populations? And so, maybe the subsidies work for some set of people, the insurance policies work for a different set of people. And so you can imagine some sort of almost like conditional treatment for different employers on a platform, depending on which types of interventions are going to move the needle? Or does it seem like, the effectiveness of those things is pretty correlated?
I'm glad you asked that question. It's actually very high up on the list of to-dos, and it's obviously very doable. So your question is like, essentially, are the same people who are positive respondents to performance screening tests the same ones that are responsive to the wage subsidy? And I don't actually know the answer. My strong suspicion is that they're the same ones, but based on how important the job type is, and how certain employers seem to be hiring for particular types of jobs repeatedly. But it's a very important question. And the platform actually at first thought about having many options, just as you might. So for example, if it's the case that different employers prefer different solutions, then of course the platform would also prefer to just offer the menu. So that's one of the options. And so before we either decide to go the menu route or the one policy fits all, we're definitely gonna have to check to see that they're correlated or not. Thank you.
Got it. Great. Cool. So another person asks, you mentioned that COVID hasn't influenced responses so far, but what about now that there is high unemployment? Do you expect changes? Also, what job types are you typically targeting?
Yeah, we had multiple, so even before COVID, we were highly suspicious that the labor market tightness mattered a lot. So the best evidence we have about how responsive these answers are to unemployment are probably from this question around unemployment. So here we randomize the option of saying yes, but only if unemployment is very high. And under these three local unemployment conditions, 2%, 6%, and 10%, we don't see much difference in the share that are saying yes at each subsidy level. So I think your prior was the same as mine, which is that when unemployment is extremely high, this should be the very last group that an employer turns to. But I think in this context, so these are short-term jobs, they're temporary jobs, and it seems like a share of the employers who are doing this are actually doing it because they positively want to have second chance workers, as they're so called by many employers. To some extent, this is helping with their branding, and there seems to be social motives, pro-social motives for this. So for that reason, I actually don't expect them to be very sensitive to the post-COVID conditions. But that's my speculation. We're going to find out, obviously, fairly soon.
Cool, awesome. Another question, so great presentation. What about the skills needed for the type of jobs under study? Do your results fit better to a particular skill group, for instance, low, middle, or high skill?
Oh, so absolutely, our results are very targeted towards low skill groups. So that was the question. It was about the worker's skill set, right? Yeah. So
yeah.
So the worker skill set here, uniformly across the platform, is low, and that means that we're not actually well equipped to answer this question of how this would be different if, in fact, we were trying to test for higher skill jobs. Our inclination was that there would be fewer people with a criminal record that were equipped to do higher level. It's not equipped, but it would match the qualifications if there was high education requirements or high skill requirements or high training requirements. There would be a smaller pool eligible for that group. So that's why we focused on this particular subset. But that doesn't mean that, so the answer to the question, but B, I think that there's definitely room for doing some work in that area based on some of the, some work in that area based on the certain types of like high skill, people skill jobs with at least requiring a lot of customer interaction, sophistication. All right, let me end it there.
Oh, great, thanks. Another question we have is, did you measure by race, gender, age, and other demographic data?
Okay, so this is a really important question for a number of reasons. What's really critical about all of these solutions in the context of an online labor platform is that there's no alternative way for the employer to discriminate based on race or gender in this case. So for example, you might be really concerned that if you remove the background check, certainly we saw this in Ban the Box papers, that employers will try to find alternatives for that removal. And one popular alternative is to just start screening out African Americans at a higher rate than than white applicants. In this context, that's not possible because employers are not allowed to list as one of their qualifications, a person must be of a particular ethnic background or have a particular gender. And so even though we can see the race and gender of the worker and the race and gender actually of the employer as well, or at least it doesn't come into play in terms of the match made. If I hope that makes sense. So it doesn't come into play precisely because the platform has found an allocation method that doesn't allow for selection on those dimensions. So both we can't measure what the spillovers would be in another environment, but the huge advantage here is that we get demand explicitly in the absence of alternative screening.
Great, thanks. I guess one additional question I had that is maybe kind of a two-part question is, I know when you had that slide that you were sort of talking about the cost of these different interventions. I think you were starting to allude to this, but I guess I was wondering if you could talk more about how the results of this study might impact, I guess, sort of like online platform design or, labor market design more specifically in terms of, like how a platform designer might think about, sort of changing the design of a platform to help more WCCs find employment. And then I guess I'm also just thinking if you've thought about or if you have any results around, beyond the, I guess, like societal benefits of doing work like this, if I'm thinking about just like a profit maximizing labor market, or if I'm thinking about, the employers that are hiring, like, is there any evidence that sort of hiring this population of workers is actually going to, lead to better business outcomes?
Yeah, well, okay, so I'm glad you asked the question. So I guess we're lucky in some ways here, in the sense that the pool of quote unquote disadvantaged workers that we're studying are in this case unfairly disadvantaged from like a productivity perspective, or at least it doesn't appear that they're lower productivity. It appears that they are in fact doing better in these types of jobs as rated by the employers who just don't know exactly who's who. So in that case, there is a clear kind of efficiency gain here, both because the platform had been screening out people who were doing a good job. Employers were satisfied with these people, and so there was just a problem of a clear problem of information. Now, that might actually be true for lots of other disadvantaged groups. Like our hope is that it's also true, in other platform settings where there's a lot more discrimination, probably the difference in productivity between the disadvantaged group is smaller than employers expect. And so you can sort of think about the same interventions playing a role there. But maybe even more generally, like the idea now that the platform has of investing in these insurance policies instead of having screening up front can let them drop a lot of different types of screens. So they had previously, and I think a lot of platforms, they try to screen on a number of dimensions of potentially bad outcomes, including having people drug tested, having them go through some kinds of certifications for certain jobs, posting more information than you might think is necessary for their identity verification, all of these things. And I think it's in part because a lot of labor platforms haven't really thought about insurance as a viable alternative. I'm not sure, it might be that the implementation turns out to be really hairy in the sense that like there's false claims and the verification process for those claims is really costly. We don't know yet, but I would say that it's kind of an exciting set of innovations for labor market design around that. And then the very last point that I'll make is just like, I think we learned this very clearly from Amanda's past work, Amanda's Palace, but just the repeated effectiveness of having that first review it shows up in a lot of places, and it should be really used broadly, I think. I mean, it's like a very, there's so many ways to accomplish that goal of getting that first review completed. And it seems to just do magical. So I would say that finding, seeing it in so many places has been helpful for it.
Great, thanks. One more question, I think, and then I'll let David maybe give a couple of quick closing remarks. This is related to that last answer that you had. So willingness to hire for variable levels of jobs completed, 1, 25, etc., didn't appear to drive a large effect across levels. Were you able to study the sensitivity of willingness to hire for variable levels of performance reviews when only one previous job was completed? And if so, were the findings similar? So I guess the question is, when there is just that one review, is the effect of that one review different when it's a 5-star review versus, say, a 3 or 4-star review?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that question. So, but I think that's really worth exploring. So like in Amanda's work, she looked at like a crude review versus a very detailed review, looking at sort of like whether the text made a difference. And she found that that additional level of detail didn't matter much. But that doesn't necessarily mean that whether it's a 5 or a 4 isn't super important. So obviously here we had been using just a 5-star probability of a 5-star, assuming everything else was, you know, a binary bad outcome. Yeah, so absolutely worth understanding. And my strong hunch, given like the bimodal nature of the reviews in general, which I've studied a lot of these platforms now, is that 4 and 5 are treated similarly, and everything less than that is treated like a really bad sign. But that has to do with like review skew and also poor inference.
Got it, cool. I think we maybe have time for one more question if anyone has one last question that they want to ask Zoe. But if not, then great, I'll just hand it over to David for concluding remarks. Thanks again, Zoe. This is really cool work and obviously really important work too. So I'm really glad that we were able to host you today. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Zoe. As it turns out, a friend of mine locally is the CEO of a startup in your space. I'm sure they'd love to promote your paper on their newsletter. So I'll circle back to you on that. Thanks again, Zoe. Great, important work. This is but one of a series of lunch seminars, as you all know. And next week we have the pleasure of having Dave Rand give the lunch talk in our seminar series. Dave's a professor at the MIT Sloan School. He's a really interesting biologist, economist, technologist, and along with Sinan Aral and Dean Eccles has been focusing a lot on true and false news in social media. So we look forward to hearing him present next Wednesday, same time, same station. And thanks again, Zoe. Wish everybody the best. Take care.
Thanks again.
Bye-bye.